Hey y'all, I just finished the novel Final Fantasy VII Remake, Traces of Two Past, and I wanted to come on here and talk about it a bit, because I feel like a lot of people don't really know that this, let alone the other FF7 novels even exist. Traces of Two Past explores the backstories of Tifa and Aerith from childhood to the start of FF7 Remake, which is a huge time span, and it's something that I wanted more of throughout the compilation. Just like everything else in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, this was written by Nojima himself, which if you don't know, he's the original scriptwriter for the entirety of the FF7, FF10 series, most of the mainline Kingdom Hearts titles, and, fun fact, Stranger of Paradise, the best game of all time. This book was released in 2021, a year after the remake release, but it was officially released in English in 2023, while the Coda chapter was written before the remake released and was added to this novel as a bonus story, but I'll talk more about that later. So the biggest questions here are, will this novel have huge implications for Rebirth's story? Should I read this before Rebirth? Is it canon? Is it supplementary material? And to get these answers out the way, it is canon to the Rebirth and original timeline, but it doesn't have major implications for Rebirth's story. Just a few lines at the end. This isn't Kingdom Hearts or Nier, where they lock world-bending lore behind a concert pamphlet or a McDonald's special order, but I will say that it does add a lot of context to the world and characters of the remake in the original Final Fantasy VII. It retells key scenes from the original, such as the Nibelheim flashback, with much more personal and emotional backgrounds and depth compared to the video games, which is something that I didn't know I wanted, again, considering how many times the compilation has taken us through these events. There's also a ton, and I do mean a ton, of new events covered in this novel, such as Aerith's childhood and Hojo's captivity with her mother, and Tifa learning her combat style, which, granted, has been covered before, but not to this depth. If you're going into this book with the expectation that it will explain everything as to why certain new events are happening in the remake timeline, you'll just be disappointed. That being said, you should definitely read these books if you're a fan of the series, as they add so much world building. Thematically, while the story of Traces of Two Past is marketed as Tifa and Aerith's backstories, I'd argue that the entire book is better seen as an exploration of how Shinra's domination corrupts every facet of people's daily lives as well as the planets for the sake of profit, but told from Tifa and Aerith's unique perspectives and lives. Because these stories are told outside of the lens of Cloud's perspective, Nojima is able to explore how the towns of Final Fantasy VII were built off Shinra's influence and rise to power, as well as how these decisions impact its residents from their own perspectives. I think this approach is so much more valuable than just having more fan service and compilation plot building. This approach allows for substantial world building for both the original and the remake timelines, which is something that I feel has been missing from the heart of the compilation for years, which loves to retcon and add a lot of fan service. Nothing here feels like it was added for the sake of having something new or to retcon something we already know. And that being said, I want to spend the rest of the video covering some of the world building and thematic elements in these novels. Tifa's story in Traces of Two Past takes place immediately after FF7R's final scene in the world map. The entire story is told to the Avalanche Party by Tifa in real time, with her reminiscing on her past. She starts by telling her experiences from the age of 6 to her current age of 20 and spends a great deal of time and detail on each age. Because of where the present time is in this story, Nojima writes this with the assumption that people reading it have only experienced the first FF7 remake, and the only thing it spoils past leaving Midgar is Tifa's perspective of the Nibelheim flashback. At the same time, Nojima effectively manages to appeal to longtime fans of the original with elements and locations of future events in the remake without lowering the quality or writing or skirting around spoilers just like the remake does. Because Tifa is from the middle of nowhere in Nibelheim, we get to explore how these people came to populate a remote mountain town that was built for the sake of maintaining a reactor. Tifa recalls a lot of the history of Nibelheim's development, the citizens' personalities, and how Shinra's treatment of Nibelheim citizens impacted her. Here's a few examples of the world building done throughout the Nibelheim section. Tifa talks about how she knows how Shinra soldiers are on the way due to the steady increase in cell service, which is otherwise weak or non-existent if they weren't there. This is a nice detail that I never really thought about while playing the games. Like, there's no telephone lines or anything, and so you're like, oh, they just have cell service, but nah, like, it's actually hard for them to come by because they're in such a remote space. Another exploration that I liked was that Tifa's childhood friends, who were all boys, all grow up and yearn to move out to become soldiers in Midgar and treat her as a prize to fight for and return to. In this section, Tifa as a child is able to reflect on being objectified and how it made her feel as a person, and why she strives to have her own agency. A good chunk of this section also covers Tifa's role in Nibelheim's community after her mother's passing, as well as how she learned and taught her community Zangen's fighting style. The story then transitions off the back of the Nibelheim flashback to Tifa's long recovery process in the slums of Midgar, which is something that I believe has never been extensively covered before. She's saved by some people in a backroom hospital in the Sector 8 slums, and Tifa, being a young woman with no money in the middle of nowhere, is unable to repay her hospital debt, which means that she must work it off for literal years throughout the story, changing the tone of it forever. There's an interesting dynamic throughout this section of the story, and really the rest of the story, and how the people that rescue her are forced to have her repay a debt to repay their own debt in ways that all stem from Shinra's corruption. The slumlords that run and protect the sector are barely getting by and paying Shinra themselves, so they force the clinic to pay a debt that they can't afford, which in turn forces Tifa to work in a way to pay a debt that she can't afford. These types of trickle-down relationships are explored all throughout the novel in different ways, which is why the world building is so interesting. A perspective that I appreciate is Tifa's background as someone moving from the country to Midgar as an impoverished or lower class person. This perspective is also explored through the NPCs in the compilation, but it's never done as extensively or emotionally as this one. We see the numerous ways that she has to adjust to her new life, such as finding ways to make money, the overbearing smell of the slums, and even her not having a personal space in ways such as being hustled to use a shower, which is something I want to address in this video actually. So when I was looking at reviews, I noticed this comment come up so many times that it merits actually bringing this up in this video. But a lot of the reviews I read in the book got so hung up on Nojima focusing so much on Tifa's desire to simply take a shower, and I think it's such a weird take and stems from how much the fanbase is used to objectifying Tifa as like a character. And the reason that Nojima places so much emphasis on Tifa's process of even taking a shower wasn't for fan service, it's to convey how much of a struggle her life is as an impoverished person. Like, when you're impoverished you have no personal space, and showering is a luxury, which is why he spent so much time emphasizing that fact by bringing it up so much. Throughout this medical recovery section, Tifa self-reflects on how Shinra took everything from her while fighting to survive quite literally under Shinra's rule in the slums. As Tifa spends years working off her debt and eventually finding her job through Marl at 7th Heaven, she meets Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge and eventually discovers them to be Avalanche members, further connecting the intro of the game. It's here that Tifa meets Barrett and Marlene through working at 7th Heaven, who she discovers is searching for Jesse under the guise of wanting to attend a planetology meeting, when in reality he wants to join Avalanche. This story goes into relatively extensive detail on planetology's origins as a religion, with the most important detail being that Shinra basically directly opposes planetology and actively shuts down gatherings involving it in fear of Avalanche propaganda. It's also revealed that through the building of Midgar, Shinra also normalized widespread agnosticism in direct opposition to the planetology religion, to the point to where it's the dominant religion in Midgar. While those are just the highlights of the themes and world building of Tifa's story, there's so much more that's explored throughout it that I didn't even talk about, so I highly recommend that you read this novel for yourself. Aerith's half of the story further explores Tifa and Aerith's two sides of the same coin design through their narrative. They both had very harsh childhoods due to Shinra destroying their lives, and they're both able to connect with each other in the present through sharing their stories. This part of the story is also told in the present that's actually only going to be playable in Rebirth, which is the scene where they sneak onto the Shinra cargo ship in disguise. Aerith's story begins with her and her mother escaping Hojo's captivity, which I don't think has been covered this extensively or personally before. The scene is able to gradually and clearly explore how Aerith went from being a cheerful, naive girl to losing everything as she learns about the corruption that Shinra has caused to the planet and its inhabitants in pursuit of the Cetra. Once she's rescued by Elmira, the story is able to fully flesh out her motives and thoughts for taking Aerith in. We also get to hear Aerith's perspective on being adopted and the burdens that she feels from practically forcing it upon Elmira. We also get an extensive look at Aerith's reaction to being pursued by the Turks, which I absolutely love. There's something terrifying about the implication of literally being hunted down as the last of your race in a place where you can't escape. Most of this half of the story is spent exploring Elmira's family history, how the orphanage was built and operated, and how generational wealth is accumulated and maintained by families in the slums under Shinra's rule. It spends much more time exploring the structure of Midgar's slums and how it divides families rather than focusing on solely Aerith. This was a nice bit of world building, if at times a bit long-winded, but I still really enjoyed it. While Tifa was the main driver of her story, Aerith feels more like an observer at times, which is kind of the case if you think about it. In regards to the connections to Rebirth, there were multiple implications that Aerith is able to give people premonitions or visions that they shouldn't know about, which is definitely a callback to her ability in the remake. And at the very end of the novel, Aerith teases Tifa by saying that we should talk about their experiences as boyfriends, which is a clear tease that the two of them were going to talk about Zack in Rebirth. My favorite part of the story by far though was the coda short story at the end. As I said before, this was a short story by the name of Final Fantasy VII, Picturing the Past, and that was released a month before the remake was originally released. And I feel like everyone should read this, so I won't spoil too much, but it was a really nice mystery short story that had really clever plot twists and connections to the remake. The reason I felt this story was so effective to me in terms of world building and narrative is that the story is told from the present perspective of a Shinra military trooper following the impact of the development of a Shinra reactor 15 years prior. The story is told non-linearly at first, so you get the satisfaction of feeling the pieces click into place as you read. To give a spoiler-free take on the story and theme, Shinra created an incentive program targeting impoverished soldiers to go out and discover Mako sites for reactor developments. Because the story was so early on in Midgar's history, Mako poisoning was seen as a risk, but not enough to fully regulate it for the sake of profit, similar to radiation poisoning or mining in real life. This meant that Shinra was essentially sending these soldiers to their deaths through Mako poisoning under the guise of financial security and glory. Through this story, we get to see how Shinra's promises directly influences individuals who can't afford to not believe them firsthand, and how Shinra slowly kills them in their dreams for taking their only option. This short story, along with other stories, perfectly tie into Final Fantasy VII's themes of environmentalism, government corruption, loss, and self-identity while building the world of Final Fantasy VII in the ways that it couldn't afford to through other mediums. Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I hope that more people check it out, even if it's not as connected to the future of the remake series as some people wanted it to be. I plan on reading the other FF7 novels after Rebirth, so let me know if you want me to cover those in the future. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Have fun with Rebirth. If you want to watch me stream it, I'm going to be streaming that all day. Check me out, and have a good one.